If you have the pages that we sent out for last week's shir from the Hegyonei Halacha, then we got up to page 49. So let's just review so that we get a very easy takeoff. We said that there were three levels in the mitzvah of Ner Chanuka. There's the basic Ikar mitzvah, which is Ner each ubeso. So it doesn't matter how many people are in the household, you light one candle. Then we get up to Darga Aleph of Mahadrin, and that's called Ner L'Kol Echad V'Echad. So if there are 10 people in the household, we'll light 10 candles. And that will be the 10 candles that we'll light every single night of Hanukkah. Then we jack it up to Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin, that's Darga Shniya, Darga Beis, and that is Mosif V'Holech according to Beis Hillel, and Holech Upoches according to Beit Shammai. So Beit Shammai starts with 8, and he goes down. Beis Hillel start with 1 and go up. So it's either descending order, and that's called Lahafchis Es Ha'or, to make the or lower, on the low level, or Lahosif Es Ha'or, to increase the light. The Gemara gives two explanations, if you recall, for this machlokes. One machlokes is whether it's Keneged Yomim Hanichnasim or Yomim Hayotzim, and the other explanation was whether it's Keneged Parei Chag or we apply the principle of Mailim B'Kodesh below Moridin B'Kodesh. Today we'll try to see if we can fit in the nafkaminas between these two explanations of the machlokes Beis Hillel Beit Shammai. We spent a lot of time last time trying to figure out why Ner Chanuka, of all mitzvahs, is singled out for Hidur mitzvah, and on top of that, Hidur Mina Hidur. And we had one mahalach based on the Beis Halevi that the Hidur mitzvah here in the Chashmonoim was that instead of using thin wicks, they used thick wicks to make the light more beautiful. We had a Rabbi Avram Lifshitz, and he had a bomb of a chiddush that the Pach HaShemen was designated for the Kohen Gadol's Minchas Chavitim, not for the Ner of the menorah. And that's why it had the Chosem of the Kohen Gadol. He wanted to make sure that nobody would take his shemen that was singled out for his Minchas Chavitim and confuse it with other menachos, because he was Mahader as a mitzvah, and the shemen that he put in that pach for his Minchas Chavitim was shemen kosis. And that's how the Chashmonoim, when they found this pach, were able to redirect it and use it for the Ner Shebenorah. Because Ner Shebenorah must be kosis. And this was, in fact, kosis. And that's one of the main discussions that we had last week. I'm just mentioning it to remind us of what we studied last week. Two explanations as to why the Hidur mitzvah was the way that the Nes, the miracle, came to be, and hence we commemorate that Nes with Hidur mitzvah as a central element in Ner Chanuka. That's what we discussed. Now, the last thing that we picked up on was to try to understand the connection between Ner Chanuka and Parei Chag, according to Beit Shammai. After all, Parei Chag have to do with Chag HaSukkos, whereas the Ner that we're talking about is Ner Chanuka. What's the connection here between the mitzvah of Purim on the Chag of Sukkos and the mitzvah of Ner in the holiday of Chanukah? And last time we mentioned the Das Kanim Lebali Atosfos in their commentary on Parshas Emor. And I want to review that quickly because there's an alternative based on the same Parsha in Emor of the Baal HaTurim. So we're going to open up a Chumash to Perek Chaf Gimel of Sefer Vayikra. We're going to take a look at the last section in Perek Chaf Gimel and the beginning of Perek Chaf Dal. At the end of Perek Chaf Gimel, after the Torah goes through the various regolim, making the entire circle, it ends up with Chag HaSukkos. And the Torah says, "B'chamisha Yom Chodesh Hashvi," etc., etc. B'Sukkos Teishu Shivas Yomim, Chagosam Sam Chag Lashem. Fine. Then we get to Perek Chavdal. Perek Chavdal, immediately on the footsteps, on the heels, so to speak, of Sukkos, addresses the mitzvah of Ner Shebemigdash. By Daber Hashem al Moshe Limor Tzav es Bnei Yisrael Yikhu Elecha Shemen Zayesach Chasis Lamaor Lahalos Ner Tom. And this unit of psukim ends with pasuk Dalet Al Menorah Torah Yarach Es Haneros Lifnei Hashem Tom. The next parsha immediately after that, beginning with pasuk Hey, is the parsha of what we call Lechem HaPanim. And if you fast forward to pasuk Ches, the Torah says B'yom HaShabbos Yarchena Lifnei Hashem Tamid. So the mitzvah of Lechem HaPanim has a special relationship to Shabbos, because from one week to the other, on Shabbos, they replaced last week's Lechem HaPanim with the new, fresh-baked Lechem HaPanim. So we have the following structure. And we're going to hold down Darshin and Smichus, that we are Doresh Smichus HaParshas. We have the parsha of Chag HaSukkos, followed by the parsha of the mitzvah of the menorah, and right after that, the Lechem HaPanim, which is a mitzvah on Shabbos. So to review the Das Kena Mibali HaTosfos, it's no coincidence that the mitzvah of Ner Shebemigdash appears immediately following Chag HaSukkos, because the Torah wants to teach us something about Ner in the menorah that we derive from Chag HaSukkos. Hence the Shita Beit Shammai of Holchim v'Pochsim, according to the second interpretation of Beit Shammai, Keneged Parei HaChag. The Torah goes out of its way to connect the Chag, and of course the Purim of the Chag, with the menorah, which is indicative of Chanuka. Unbelievable. And that's Keneged Parei HaChag. So that we have as an explanation of Beit Shammai. What are Beis Hillel going to say? You know that we always talk about Mila'el and Milara, whereas Beit Shammai are connecting the four psukim at the beginning of Perek Chavdal, the unit of Ner She B'Migdash, with the previous parsha, and that's the contiguity, that's the smichus, meaning we go back to Sukkos. Beis Hillel are going to connect the parsha of Ner Shebemigdash at the beginning of Perek Chavdal with the parsha that comes right afterwards, which is the mitzvah of Lechem HaPanim on Shabbos. With regard to Shabbos, we have halacha of Mosifim. What does it mean, Mosifim? That's called to add to Shabbos. We had a long discussion about this a few weeks ago. Tosefes Shabbos, Mosifim me'achol ala kodesh. Hence, Beis Hillel derive from the contiguity, the smichus between Ner Shebemigdash and Lechem HaPanim of Shabbos, that we should be mosif b'holik, that we should add, just like we increase the Shabbos by adding a Tosefes Shabbos, we increase the Neros of Chanuka by going from 1 to 2 to 3 until we culminate at the number 8. So this is the Das Kena Mibali HaTosfos based on the Smichus HaParshas. Now we want to add the Baal HaTur, which is on the bottom of your page 49, if you have the pages. The Baal HaTur wants to know, why is it that in this unit of 4 psukim at the beginning of Perek Chavdal, the Torah starts with Lashon Yachid and ends with Lashon Rabin? In the opening description of the Ner Shebemigdash, the pasuk says Lahalos Ner Tamid, one single Ner. In the end of the parsha, Al HaMenorah Torah Yaroch Es HaNeros, in plural. Ner, singular. Neros, in plural. Why the transition? Says the Balaturim, this is a remez for the Shita Beis Hillel. And on the first night of Chanuka, we light one candle. And then we increase and go to the plural one night after the other. And that's why it says Neros. So that again, whereas according to the Das Kedah Baliatosis, you have two ways of going in the Smichus. One would be Miliel, and that would be the Shita Beit Shammai. The other would be Milara, forward, Lahava, the Shita Beis Hillel. According to Balaturim, when we look at this parsha, we see a remez for the Shita Beis Hillel of Mosif Bahol. As a parenthetical insert, before we go on to the Aruch HaShulchan, tonight, in Mitzvah Hashem, I'm giving a shir on a sefer called Likutei Halachos. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's not a halachic sefer. It's attached to the Shulchan Aruch. It was written by Rabbi Nosson Sternhartz. And in his analysis of this week's Parshas Vayetzer, he quotes the Medrash Rabbah that says about Yaakov Avinu, Vayeshev Be'eretz Megurei Aviv. Megurim, according to the Medrash Rabbah, is a remez to Gerus, meaning the word Megurim in its Shoresh comes from Gimel Reisha Ger. And the Medrash tells us that Yosef Hatzad, that Yaakov was following in the legacy of Avram Avinu, and he's Megayer Gerim, meaning he spread the light of Torah. And then immediately afterwards, the parsha says, Eila told us Yaakov, Yosef. And Chazal say that Yosef was in the image of his father. He followed the legacy and imitated the father. Hence, he also was outreach, being Megayer Gerim. And in this presentation of Likutei Halachos, he says that the name Yosef indicates that he's Mosif. And Yosef now is a predating of Beis Hillel. Mosif Aholik, take the light of Torah and spread it. And be Makarev people who are far from Torah by spreading the light of Torah. B'Shamai, let's keep to ourselves. You know, we don't want to introduce foreign elements. People are rechokim. We don't know what kind of impact and influence they'll have. But Beis Hillel says, Mosif B'Holech. Add to the light, spread the light, uplift and inspire people. And Yosef HaTzadik in our parsha is a reflection, or if you will, a premonition predating Beis Hillel, because he's out there being Megayer Gerim and being Megayer the Rechokim and Chamas HaRechokim. In any event, let's go back to our subject for today. The Aruch HaShulchan sees a very definite connection between the 8 days of Sukkot, culminating with Shmini Atzeres, and the 8 days of Chanuka. And he tells you to look at the Sefer HaChashmonaim, that the Yevanim were gozer gzeros to be mavatel Chag HaSukkos. One agenda of the Yevanim was to uproot Chag HaSukkos, which, by the way, makes sense if you consider that the 70 parim that were brought on Sukkos are holchin v'pochsin, they go down in number because it's keneged the umos ha'olam, the shivim umos ha'olam. So that bothered them tremendously, and they were gozer gzeros to be mevatel Chag HaSukkos. He says, therefore, when the Chashmonaim succeeded and triumphed over the Yevanim, they reinstituted the 8 days of Sukkot. As a result, the mitzvah of Chanuka is a zikaron that we replace, or shall we say, bring back to life those 8 days. But again, not the 8 days of Sukkot, but the 8 days of Chanuka, which really are, so to speak, a reincarnation of the 8 days of Sukkot. So now that the bittul the undermining of Chag HaSukkos has terminated, and now we reestablish the Mikdash. Now we have 8 days of Chanuka connected the 8 days of Sukkot. And if you add that to what we discussed before about the Smichos HaParshios, you begin to see why there's a Smichos HaParshios in Vayikra Chav Gimel Chav Daled between the mitzvah of Chag HaSukkos, meaning the 8 days of Chag HaSukkos, and the Ner, which alludes to the Ner of Chanukah, which is 8 days. And Min HaShamayim, there was a Nes, and the Shemen lasted for 8 days. And that was the Simon Min HaShamayim that up in heaven, they were very happy with the establishment of 8 days of Chanukah as a Zikaron for the 8 days of Sukkot that were now reinstated. And once again, this gives us another dimension to understand and appreciate Beit Shammai, that the candles of Chanukah should be holech v'polches keneged Parei Chag, because again, the entire establishment of the mitzvah of Chanukah for 8 days was to replace, or to, shall we say, symbolize the victory that we have, that now the 8 days of Sukkot can be celebrated as they should be. Okay. Now what we want to talk about is a major machlokas between Tosfos on the one hand and the Chachmei Sfarad on the other. Chachmei Sfarad here means the Rambam and the Ritva and other Rishonim of Sfarad. What is the issue? We're all familiar with this issue. Anytime you open up the sugya of my Chanukah in Masechta Shabbos, Daf Chaf Aleph, Chaf Beis, you always come in contact and encounter this sugya. The issue is, how do we define Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin? These are the great Mahadrin. They realize and implement the mitzvah on its ultimate level, the mitzvah in Amuvka, the perfect ideal mitzvah. But what is the relationship between Mahadrim and Mahadrim and what came before it? And here there are two roads that diverged in a yellow wood. One way is to understand that the Mahadrim and Mahadrim is a greater Hidur of the original mitzvah. So we go back to stage number 1 of Ner Ishu Beso. And now Ner Ishu Beso takes on a new dimension of the additional miracle as it grows from day to day. And that's the Mahadrin, that first night 1, second night 2, third night 3. The other way of understanding it is that no, we're not going to take the Mahadrin and Mahadrin and connect it to the Ikar mitzvah, but rather it's an extension of the Mahadrin. It's a second floor on top of the Mahadrin. If we go with the first approach, then Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin is going to completely sideswipe and omit the Mahadrin. We're going to take the Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin and go back to the original Ikar mitzvah. So, for example, if there are 10 people in the house, on the second night of Chanukah, how many candles are we going to light? 2 candles. Why? Because in this first approach, what we're going to do is we're going to completely ignore, or shall we say, skip over the Mahadrin for the sake of preferring the Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin. And now Mahadrin falls by the wayside. And if I'm being Makayim the mitzvah Chanukah with Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin, there's no Mahadrin. The second approach says no. If you have 10 people in the household, then on the second night of Chanukah, you'd be lighting 20 candles, meaning you're going to light 10 candles keneged the Anshe Bayis, which means the Mahadrin, and on top of that, each one of the candles that represent each one, respectively, of the Bnei Abayis, of the household members. Now we have to add Keneged Yomim, Hanichnasim, Yom HaYotzim, and according to Beis Hillel, it would mean that for each person, we're going to light 2 candles on the second night. And if there are 10 people in the household, that means 20 candles. If there are 10 people on the third night, we're going to be lighting 30 candles and 40 candles and so forth and so on until we get to the magic number 80 candles. The Bali Tosfos come to the conclusion that Mahadrin min Mahadrin has to go back to the Ikar mitzvah. And we have to skip over and omit the Mahadrin. Why? We'll get to that in just a minute. The Rambam, on the other hand, is of the opinion that Mahadrin is built on the Ikar mitzvah. Mahadrin min Mahadrin is built on the Mahadrin. So we go up from one level to the other. If, let's say, we called the Ikar mitzvah Darga Aleph, then the Mahadrin is Darga Beis, and Mahadrin min Mahadrin is Darga Gimel. The Shitas HaRambam is that we will implement Mahadrin min Mahadrin on top of Darga Beis. So Darga Gimel is built as an extension of Darga Beis. Hence, we have on the 8th day, if there are 10 members of the household, 80 candles. 10 candles for each night for the Mahadrin, Keneged Anshe Abayis, Ner L'Kol Echad V'Echad, and each one of the Anshe Abayis is going to add with each increasing the increment of days, and then when you get to 8, the 8th day of Chanuka, you already have 80 candles. What is the machlokas about? Tosfos, and you'll see this on page 51, explains the following: that the Mahadrin min Mahadrin want to indicate and publicize the Ribui HaNes. Ribui HaNes meaning how the miracle extended day after day after day for 8 days. By adding an extra candle on each night, you publicize, that's called heker, the Ribui HaNes. The Mahadrin, on the other hand, is not Ribui HaNes, but Ribui Hodas Kol Ish V'ish. That instead of lighting one candle for the entire household, we have a candle for each member of the household. However, Tosfos says you can't have both. In our idiomatic language, you can't have your cake and eat it. Why? If you're going to make a heker, says Tosfos, for the Ribui HaNes, and you're going to have not 2 candles on the second night, but 20 candles on the second night, because there are 10 Bnei Abayis, or for that matter, let's say we would have 12. It doesn't matter what it is. It's not going to be a heker, because when you look at the number of candles, you don't see the progression from one day to the other. You have no clue as to how to interpret the number of candles. Take, for example, the minhag back in the old country, 1,000 years ago, was each candle was in a ner cheres. They had a receptacle that was made of pottery, of earthenware, and each candle was separate. And now you put all these clay cheres, one next to the other, on the windowsill. How do they know which night of Hanukkah it is? If your whole purpose of Mahadrin and Mahadrin is to make a heker for the increase of the nest day after day, one day after the next day, well, I look at the candles and I see a strange number. I don't know what that number indicates. Maybe it indicates that that's how many Bnei Abayis there are. So let's say, for example, you had a household of 5 people. Make it a little easier for us. And on the second night, you're going to light 10 candles, 5 for the Mahadrin, and another 5 adding for each one for the Mahadrin min Mahadrin. Then people are going to see, well, there are 10 candles. I don't know what the 10 candles mean, Maybe there are 10 B'nai Abayis. So you'll never be able to achieve Mahajim and Mahajim with a heker for the onlooker, the spectator, to understand what message you're transmitting if you're going to add the Mahajim and Mahajim on top of Mahajim. Tosfos doesn't explain to us why the Mahajim Mina Mahajim is greater and more significant than the Mahajim. Each one has a dimension of Hidur. One is connected B'nai Abayis. Look how many people are thanking Hashem for the miracle. Look how many people saved from the Yevanim and so forth and so on. And now we have Ribu Yanes, which each night there was a greater miracle, adding another, the candles lasted another day and another day and another day. It's a toss-up. But Tosfos is saying, it says Mahajim Mina Mahajim, which indicates that's even a greater level, and hence we're going to implement the Mahajim Mina Mahajim even at the expense of the Mahajim. The Rambam, on the other hand, says no. Mahajim Mina Mahajim is an extra Hidur on top of the Mahajim. On the first night, we're going to light one candle, and for Hidur, 10 candles, because there are 10 B'nai Abayis. On the second night, we'll light 20 candles until we get up to 80 candles. Now, the Ritva agrees with the Rambam Shita that we should build on Mahajim Mina Mahajim. So we have both our cake and eat it. We'll have the Mahajim and the Mahajim Mina Mahajim. But he gives a very interesting and very novel explanation. And this you'll see on the bottom of page 51. He quotes a Medrash. The Medrash goes back to the story of creation, and it says, "V'choshech al pnei taho." Choshech zu Yavan, Malchus Yavan. Why is Malchus Yavan alluded to by Choshech, by darkness? Shech shicha einem shel Yisrael b'gzeiro sehem. Obviously, there are deeper meanings here, symbols about the Einayim of Klal Yisrael. Maybe the Einayim represent the Torah, and the Yevanim try to undermine the Torah. Whatever it is, Ichshichu Einayim shel Yisrael b'gzeiro sehem. Says the Ritva, Ki derech zu nireis yoser miderech haTosfos. I prefer the approach and the ruling of the Rambam to that of Tosfos. It appeals to me more. Ki im nefarish ki Tosfos shebal abayis madlik minyan hayomim bilvad. So it means there's going to be one adlaka of ner echad, and we're going to add each night another candle. He says, Yachol sheyetze sheyishapchu hadargos. V'yehu hidurim shalamahadrim v'nahalim pachos v'hidurim shalamahadrim. If Tosfos is saying that there's a head-on collision between the Mahadrim and the Mahadrim Mina Mahadrim, we have to make a choice, and let's opt for Mahadrim Mina Mahadrim. I'm going to prove to you, says the Ritva, that you're going to diminish the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. How? Keep going. You have 10 people living in the house. B'yom hashmini, yadliku hamahadrim eser neros k'mispar b'nei habayis. Mahadrim lo yadliku k'mispar yomim shmona neros bilvad. Paradoxical case. According to Tosfos, accepting and preferring the Mahajim Mina Mahajim, on the 8th night, you will light 8 candles. That's it. There's no question about it. It's always going to be 8 candles for Mahajim Mina Mahajim on the 8th night. If there are 10 B'nai Abayis, then Mahajim would require that you light 10 candles. So because you prefer Mahajim Mina Mahajim over Mahajim, paradoxically, you reduce the number of candles. And that, in the language of the Ritva, is called hishapchus hadargos. that the darga of Mahajin Mina Mahajin lowers your standard of Mahajin from 10 candles down to 8 candles. And if the idea of Hidur is to be Motzif or to have more candles, it becomes very paradoxical when Mahajin Mina Mahajin reduces the number of candles that you would have lit for the Mahajin. On the top of page 52, he summarizes the machlokes, and he says that l'das hatos mahajim mahajim osim heker l'nes shenimshach kol shmonis yomim v'holech v'gadel miyom liyom ukshe balabais mosif ner b'chol yom nikar v'zeh hanes v'l'das harambam hahidur nas al yidei ribuyad neros. And ultimately, if you define Hidur, it's got to be an increase in the amount of candles you light. El Kain Piriyesh, Shemahajim and Mahajim Mosifim Hidur ala Mahajim. Whereas the Mahajim always remains 10 candles of the 10 B'nai Abayis. We're going to increase that number through the Mahajim Mina Mahajim with each additional night. Al Kain Piriyesh, this is the Rambam, Shemosifim b'mahajin min mahajin al hamahajin, and yirbu aneros biyosef. There'll be a larger number of candles. Kechol she'adliku yosef neros yagdil ha'or. And again, if we call Malchus Yom and Choshech, and we want to demonstrate the opposite of the Choshech, then we want to add to the Or, increase the Or. V'yagdil ha'or v'yigalel choshech shevia malchus yavan al Yisrael. And now we get to the Pri Chodesh on page 52. The Pri Chodesh wants to go back to the two explanations, the two variations of the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. And he wants to find a relationship, a connection between whether Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are arguing about Yom HaNichnasim versus Yom HaYotzim, whether they're arguing about Parei HaChag versus Ma'alim B'Kodesh. These two explanations, how do they kick in? Or do they relate at all to this machlokas rishonim about whether Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin is on top of Mahadrin or replaces the Mahadrin? He says the following. In the first explanation of Keneged Yomim HaYotzim or Yomim HaNichnasim, both Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai have the same goal, the same agenda. They may have different techniques in the specific method, but they both are coming what's called Lodia Anes Shehismid Vihisgada, that this was a continuous miracle that increased and got greater and greater with the passage of time. And again, the machlokus is how should we be modia? How do we publicize that element of hanes, masmid, umiskada? Beit Shammai has their approach, and Beis Hillel theirs. However, according to the second explanation of the machlokus between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, where Beit Shammai says poches v'holech keneged parei chag, and Beis Hillel say holech umosif keneged ma'alim b'kodesh ve'ein moridim b'kodesh. He says then their explanations, respectively, of both Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai are not related to hodas hasmodas hanes, his chadshus hanes. This machlokas has nothing to do with how we notify and publicize that the nest is growing from day to day. It has to do with technicalities, with principles. Do we derive Ner Chanukah from Chag HaSukkos, Keneged Parei HaChag, or do we derive Chanukah from the general universal principle of Ma'alim B'Kodesh? And both of these explanations could have impact on other halachas and other areas. They're not unique to Ner Chanukah to answer the question of how I can be modia the hiskadlus and the schadshus and the smadlus of the nes of Chanukah. He says the following. Why is it that the Gemara brings two different explanations for the machlokas, the tamei machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai? Says the Pri Chadash, these two explanations of the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai mispardim lefishtei deos harishonim basvaras mahadrin mina mahadrin. What does he mean? That the machlokes between Tosfos on the one hand and the Rambam on the other hand, that machlokes deals with the issue of how to express and demonstrate with a heker the nes. Can we do it by expanding not only the number of days, but also the number of people in the house? Each one had his own hatzolah and his own hodos hanes. Or should we have to drop one at the expense of the other? That machlokas between Tosfos and the Rambam would fit beautifully into the first explanation of Beis Hillel Beit Shammai. Namely, that Beis Hillel Beit Shammai have the same agenda of Hodas Hanes, in the element of Hasmodas Hanes, that the nest grows and is mischadesh from day to day. And now, in the context of such a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, and both agree to the fundamental principle that our agenda is to be modia the hiskadlus hanes, now you can ask yourself, well, can we achieve that heker of hiskadlus hanes with mahadrin and mahadrin, or it's an either-or situation? But if you take the second explanation, namely that they're arguing about principles that go way beyond the confines of Ner Chanukah, for example, Beis Hillel are waving the flag of Ma'alim B'Kodesh Lo Moridin, then the machlokas rishonim here about how we're going to achieve that heker to be modia the nes and this gadlus hanes really has nothing to do with Beis Hillel Beit Shammai. But comes along the Beis Halevi, and this is on the top of page 53, with a very interesting case. Here's the case. It's the third night of Chanuka, and he only has possession of 2 neros. What should he do? If Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel are arguing about Keneged Yom Yotzim Yom Nichnasim, well, guess what? 2 neros is not going to do it for you on the third night. What's the connection between 2 neros and the third night of Chanukah? If the purpose of adding candles and be Mekayim the Hidur mitzvah is Keneged Yom HaYotzim, 2 candles on the third night is not Keneged Yom HaYotzim. However, he says, if Beis Hillel are operating with Ma'alim B'Kodesh Lo Moridin, you never want to minimize and go back to 1 candle, because that would be a very severe violation of Ma'alim B'Kodesh Lo Moridin. You'd have to light 2 candles. Even though, again, it's not Ma'alim B'Kodesh from yesterday, because yesterday on the second night we also lit 2 candles, but at least we're not Moridin B'Kodesh. There are 2 halachas. There's one halacha of Kuvaseh, And there's another aleph of sur meira, of losas, meaning we're not allowed to be morid kedusha. We have to be mala b'kedusha. Okay, I can't be mala b'kedusha. I have the same amount of candles that I lit yesterday, but not to reduce it down to one candle. So that again, if you go with the first explanation of Beis Hillel, that it's Keneged Yom HaYotzim, then you're really fabricating a lie, because it's not 2 candles, it's 3 candles. You don't have 3 candles. It's not Keneged Yom HaYotzim. The whole concept of Hidur mitzvah of Keneged Yom HaYotzim will fall by the wayside, and you have no choice because you don't have the additional candle to reflect the fact that there's an additional mess, and it's the 3rd night of Chanuka. But if you're going with Ma'ila B'Kodesh, then yesterday you lit 2 candles, today you can't light less than 2 candles. So the point of our whole discussion up to this this pause that we want to take and review and collect our thoughts is, why did the Gemara bother with 2 explanations of Beis Hillel Beit Shammai? True, they are 2 valid explanations, but is there an nafkamina between them? Is the Gemara trying to convey something? Says the Pri Chadash, the nafkamina is going to be with regard to the issue of whether Mahadrin is built on top of the Mahadrin or not. If you go with the first explanation, Beis Hillel Beit Shammai, now you can analyze, well, how do we get a heker of Keneged Yom HaNichnasim and so forth and so on, if we're going to add candles connected to the Bnei Abayis. And the Beis Halevi says that there's going to be a hardcore machlokas and nafkamina about a case which falls in between the cracks, meaning it would make sense to draw one conclusion with the first explanation of Beis Hillel Beit Shammai, and an entirely different conclusion in the context of the second explanation of Beis Hillel Beit Shammai. Now, before we go on page 53, I would like to fast forward to page 62, which I think you have. Again, David is not here. Oh, David is here. David, am I right? Can you confirm that we have page 62? I don't have it in front. I have the original in front of me. But I think you have page 62 as well. And on the bottom of page 62, he quotes the Brisker Rav. The Brisker Rav says the following, that the halach of Hidur mitzvah ner Chanuka is very unique, not just because there's a Hidur on top of a Hidur, but because this goes beyond the regulations that govern Hidur mitzvah. The Gemara establishes in Bava Kama Daf Tes that Hidur mitzvah ad shlish. Let's say, for example, I have a lulav that I could purchase at 4, and there's a more beautiful, expensive lulav at 6, and that would be a Hidur mitzvah. So I'm jacking it up by a shlish. Again, you have to know the shlish milabar, shlish milago. I'm not getting into that whole machlokas. In the case of Ner Chanuka, he says, clearly you're going beyond the shlish. I mean, the very moment that you add a single candle on the second night to the one candle of the first night, you're already going beyond the shlish. You've already doubled the mitzvah. How much more so when you get to the 3rd night, the 4th night, and if you go Keneged Anshe Abayis. He says, in Mitzvas Hidur mitzvah, and that means to add up to a shlish, then Mitzvahs Hidur ner Chanuka einena bichlal zeh. You cannot assume that the same source and the same kiyum of zeh keilu v'yaveyu that applies in general in mitzvahs applies to ner Chanuka, because ner Chanuka violates the rules of the game. It's more than a shlish. And therefore, says the Brisker Rav, we have to conclude mathematically, we have no choice, that the mitzvah of Hidur mitzvah in Chanuka has something to do with the very essence of the Takon of Ner Chanukah. This is the way the Chazal will misake in the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, with one level of Hidur and another level of Mahajim Min Mahajim. And if that be the case, then we begin to really understand and appreciate why there's Mahajim Min Mahajim in Chanukah, because the Rabbanan are trying to mold this mitzvah in the way they establish it to reach an ideal, let's say to maximize Pirsum Hanes. And you can do so at one level, Darga Aleph, Darga Beis, Darga Gimel. We're not dealing with classic Mahajin Zeh Keli Anveir. He says, what happens in the case of a person who makes a mistake and he did not light the number of candles that correspond to that night of Chanuka? For example, on the third night, he lit 2 candles. Again, we'll put aside the other discussion that we had about Ma'alim B'Kodesh. But let's just focus on Hidur Mitzvah. He lit 2 candles on the third night. He says that the Chachmei Lonil had such a case, and they paskined that now, when he realizes his mistake, he should light a 3rd candle, but leave out a bracha. Why so? And the answer is because when he recited his bracha, he had in mind the candles that were in front of him. And he only had 2 candles.
This is still on the same night, yes?
Same night. He reminds himself on the same night, he's going to add a 3rd candle, but without a bracha. That's the psak of the Chachmei Lonil, quoted in the Orchos Chaim of Rabbi Aaron Lonil. You see it here in footnote number 17. So again, his das, when he made the bracha, was on all of the neiros that he had in front of him. He only had 2 neiros in front of him. He goes even a step beyond this. And he says that his das, when he lit the 2 candles, was on all the candles that he's obligated to light. Again, he mistakenly thought that he has to light 2 candles. When he realizes his mistake, he doesn't make a new bracha because the original bracha was al das techiyuv, meaning when I make a bracha, what I have in mind is that bracha should be chal on the action, a ma'aseh mitzvah, which will fulfill my chiyuv. Mistakenly, I thought all I need is 2 candles. Oh, somebody reminds me it's the night, the 3rd night, you need a 3rd candle. But the original bracha was al das, all 3 candles. That's the psak of the Chachmei Lonil. Comes along the Magen Avram, and he says the following: that according to the Chachmei Lonil, the determining factor as far as the bracha is kavanas hamavarech. What did he have in mind? If he had in mind his chiyuv, he may not have known exactly at that time. He's confused about what the nature of his chiyuv is. But the bracha, based on his kavana, was chal on all 3 candles because that's the chiyuv for that night. Can you hear me now? Okay. We had a little bit of a takala here with the internet. And you've noticed that it's happened from time to time. They still haven't solved this problem. Anyway. Yada b'tchila Shayom Yom Shlishi Shel Chanuka, v'yesh lahadlik shalosh neros, ela shelo hoyelo ki im shtei neros, v'hayasavar shelo yimtza od balayla ze ner shlishi, v'kivein b'berchaso rak al shtei neros bilvad. B'shuv nizdamen lo achar kach ner shlishi. Here's a different scenario. In the first scenario, he had in mind to light 3 candles. Again, he didn't realize that he needs to light 3 candles, but according to the Chachmei L'Nil, since his kavanah was to be Yotze his chiyuv, he had in mind 3 candles. But now we have a different scenario. Listen to this scenario. All he has is 2 candles. Later on, somebody brings him a 3rd candle, but he only had in his possession 2 candles. His mindset was, you know what? I can't fulfill the mitzvah bishleimus, the perfect ideal way, and light 3 candles. I only have 2 candles. So he had in mind that the bracha should be chal on these 2 candles because that's the best method, that's the best way that he can implement Ner Chanukah. Says the Magen Avram, now they brought him a 3rd candle. He makes a bracha on the 3rd candle. Pili Plan. Such a fine distinction between the 2 cases. In the first case, he has plenty of candles, but he mistakenly thought he's only obligated to light 2 candles. He, in truth, had in mind to light 3 candles, but he only lit 2. The bracha was chal on all 3. When he gets around to lighting the 3rd candle, he was already yotze the bracha on that 3rd candle. But in the second scenario of the Magen Avram, he knew that he had plenty of candles, but he understood. I'm sorry. In the second scenario, he only had 2 candles. Sorry. And he said, look, this is the best I can do. This is maxing out the mitzvah based on what I have in my possession. Onus Rachmana Patre. I'm going to make the bracha on 2 candles. So the bracha was chal on 2 candles. He gets a 3rd candle. He obtains a 3rd candle. There was never a bracha on that 3rd candle. He can make a bracha on the 3rd candle. Wait, just 1 second, Bobby. I want to just make sure I have it. Okay, great. Go ahead. I have my next sentence prepared. Yeah, go.
Sorry, I just want to clarify because I don't understand that when he lights, he thinks it's the first case. He thinks that it's to the 2nd night. But his kavanah the bracha is I want to be yaitz to the bracha, and it's really 3. But I don't understand why. Like if you tell me that the case was that he knew it was 3, he thought it was 3 when he made the bracha, but then he only lit 2 by accident, and then he realized later that he has to light a 3rd one. That I can hear. But if he made the bracha thinking that it was 2 and that was the chiyuv, then to say that he had in mind, he wanted to be yaitz to the chiyuv that was on him, which was 3. I don't understand.
Right, so that's the chiddush of the Chachmei L'Nil. We can get back and discuss that and analyze that, but I just want to point out that the Magen Avram is analyzing the conclusions that come from the Chachmei L'Nil. Your question, Bobby, is what do you mean he has in mind the chiyuv and he thinks that the chiyuv is 2 when it's really 3? Why does that kavanah to be yotze the chiyuv incorporate the 3rd net? That's a valid objection to the Chachmei L'Nil. But my point is, and that's where we wanted this is where the Brisker Rav that we started with comes into play, is the derivation of the Magen Avram that in a certain scenario, he will make a bracha on the 3rd candle. And what is that scenario? It's a scenario in which he had only 2 candles and he could only make a bracha on 2 candles. Now he gets a 3rd and now he has to make a bracha on the third. That's what the Magen Avram was medayik from the Chachmei Lunil. But the Pella here is Rabosai. How could you make a bracha on the third candle? He was Yotzei his mitzvah with the first two candles. Narvas, he wasn't Yotzei the Hidur of Keneged Yom HaNichnasim. It's vice dice. We draw the conclusion here from this Magen Avram, who draws his conclusion in turn from the Chachmei Lunil, that you make a bracha on Hidur mitzvah. We never found a bracha on Hidur mitzvah. Let's say I took an esrog and I made a bracha on my esrog. It was a real basic esrog. I paid 50 shekel for the esrog. Now somebody brings me a 250 shekel esrog. I don't make a bracha on that esrog. You want to shake it? Maybe it's meaningful. I don't know. That's a Reb Chaim has a declare whether it's meaningful or not. But certainly you would not make a bracha on it. You already Yotzei Yechir. What do you mean B'tzivana? You already were Yotzei. We never make a bracha on Hidur mitzvah. So we get to the Manishtana of Chanuka, right? Not the Manishtana of Pesach. Manishtana Chanuka, we call Chara mitzvahs. That the Magen Avram says we'll make a bracha on Hidur mitzvah when he gets that third candle. And again, with all the pilpul and the diukim from, a hin and a hair from the Chachmei Lunil, but the bottom line is, the Magen Avram says that according to the Chachmei Lunil, you will make a bracha on the third candle. In a case where your bracha was on the two candles, and only on the two candles. As the Brisker Rav, we have to derive the conclusion that Hidur mitzvah ner Chanuka is not an application of the general rule of Hidur mitzvah. It operates with its own. How do we say it? It dances to its own tune. What's the phrase? It has its own rules and regulations.
Dances to its own drummer.
To its own drummer. We never make a bracha on Hidur mitzvah. The answer is the Chazal will misake this mitzvah with Hidur mitzvah built into it. Hiksha bala mixmasa shekel. Kevan shikar mitzvahs ner Chanuka ner yishu beso b'ner echad bilvad ukvar kiyam a mitzvah kshev l'geshtei neros lama yavarech al ner shlishi. Afilo kiven olav meaning on the ner shlishi b'berchaso. Hare enu elo mishum Hidur mitzvah. Klum mevarchim al Hidur mitzvah. As a rhetorical question? So that is a real strong proof to the Brisker Rav that Hidur mitzvah ner Chanuka, it's more than a shlish, as we said before. It generates a bracha. We're going to have to analyze, but enough for today. What happens if he didn't make a bracha and he lit the candles? This happens all the time, by the way. Now, he's up to the second candle. Let's say it's second night of Chanuka. Can he make his bracha on the second candle? The second candle is only Hidur mitzvah. He was Yotzei the Yikar mitzvah with the first candle. It's not over Lasiyasa. But according to Magen Avram, based on his diuk from the Chachmei Lunil, you could possibly argue that we should make a bracha on the second candle. That requires a lot of study, a lot of analysis.
Except you should change the bracha. You should say Lahadir ner Chanuka.
Also, I think what's going on here, according to the Brisker Rav, is that the Hidur mitzvah is built into the mitzvah itself. And unless you fulfill
you made that bracha already. Lahadir ner Chanuka you made already. So you say you can't make this. How can you make the same bracha like that? That's also another problem.
Wait a minute, you're talking about a different scenario. Well, what's your
No,
case?
the case where we said that you only had 2 candles.
Oh, in the Magen Avram, you're saying?
Yeah,
Oh,
and now
oh,
you're
oh.
gonna light a third candle.
Right. Okay, I didn't realize you were going. I was
Sorry.
talking about a case where he reminds himself after he lit the first candle that he didn't make a bracha.
Right, and here.
Yeah. So I both said, let's just make a note of what we got up to, and then we'll have a minute's discussion as to whether or not we're going to meet next Wednesday. We got up to page 53, and we have a story here called Shneis Kanim Shahayu B'Tzidon. Echad Asa K'Beit Shammai v'Echad Asa K'Beit Hillel. So you can make a note that that's on page 53. Plus, it would be nice if, again, I'm not promising, but it would be nice if we can finish this article, but it's quite long. I don't know. Then, in the second essay, we got up to page 64.
Joe's signing off.
Shucks. Well, we still have Bruce is here, Bobby, you're here, Yudi, you're here, David's here. Let me just, anyone who thinks that we should continue next Wednesday and not take a break for Chanuka. So, in other words, if you're in favor of Dafka pushing it, that next Wednesday, when we light 3 candles, right? We should continue our learning. Just give me a show of your hands.
Okay.
So we only have 2. So it's 2 against 2. So David and Yudi are
No,
but
David said yes also.
how do you know that?
He put, you see there's a little hand?
He what?
There's a little hand on his screen.
It doesn't appear on my screen.
Oh,
there it is. That's David's hand.
no, that's
That's
Bruce's
actually
hand.
mine. I was just showing
But
you what you did.
David also had put a hand up. I don't know.
Oh.
And Yudi also had a hand up there.
And Wednesday night is the 4th night.
Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night. Right, but
Yeah,
Wednesday.
but we're learning on Wednesday morning.
If
in
we're in the
Toronto.
afternoon, then it's still the 3rd day.
Right.
Right.
It's up to Roberzon if in other
Okay.
words, are you available to give the share? And
My only issue is where to light and where. But maybe I'll see if I can do it in Harnof. So then immediately after the shear, I can light candles because, it's almost immediately afterwards. I mean, Shkia here is very early now, very early.
right.
Like you could.
I would say actually that it might even make sense to make the shear from the Canadians' point of view a little bit later because we have a longer davening and everything.
That's what I wanted to ask you. You have Hallel.
Yeah, but we start earlier, so but
Truth is, besides Hallel, there's Kriyas HaTorah.
laning, right?
Right,
So we start
laning.
earlier, but we usually go a few minutes after, and as it is, getting here for 8:15 is a challenge for like 3:15 your time. So anyway, but I don't want to push it further because then you're going to run into your Hanukkah candles.
Well,
Then maybe we could do it the other way. Well, let me ask you this. We're talking about 8:15 on your clock, correct? Could we change it, let's say, to 9 o'clock or 8:45, or that's...
In other words, after you light?
Well, I don't know
No,
if you're
that's-
after breakfast or before breakfast. I don't know.
Oh, I'm eating with you during this year.
Well, I'll tell you the truth. From what I remember of Clanton Park, those gigantic, what do they call those croissants? I don't know what word you use.
Right, Danishes.
I remember when I came to say a few words about Talmud and Rebbe. I don't know if you remember that. And we,
Right.
that was in honor of the yard site. Anyway, I remember I could have made a meal out of one of those croissants. So I don't know if
Right.
you're before breakfast or after breakfast, but
Anyway. So
if I could light theoretically at, let's say, 4:45, I have to check in the calendar and see exactly.
right.
Isn't
I
my
think,
week about 5 o'clock next week?
That's a question. On the Canadian clock, it would be 9 o'clock. That's already,
No, no.
I don't know if you're going to work, you're out.
I think let's leave it the regular time, 8:15. And that will finish at 9:15, and then you can light candles there.
By 15, 20 minutes later, after the end of the sheet.
Yeah, let's
All
leave
right,
it that
Belina,
way.
but I'll just check it out. My wife is in New York now.
Oh,
That's because my mother-in-law's not feeling well, but
Nice.
when Charlie comes, the whole situation changes. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem.
Refuah Shalema.
Yeah, so my wife has to decide when she's coming back. I don't know if she's going to make it for the beginning of Hanukkah, but we'll see how things go with my. So I don't know if that'll have any impact on this or whatever. But
We can
On
keep
my
it fluid.
synagogues,
yeah, I'll get in touch with David because David has the email thing, so we'll confirm it then. All right then.
Fine.
So let me wish
Okay.
you a Freilich and Chanukah. Now
All
that
the
we won't
best.
see each other before Sunday for sure. All right, Kol Tu. Bye bye.
All right.